Diana stood at the window of her luxurious apartment on the top floor of one of Prague's most prestigious buildings, looking at the city. Outside the window, glowing lights floated in the fog, and below, hundreds of cars flickered in the night stream. The metropolis, as always, lived its own turbulent life, and Diana felt that this life around her, the lives of the people on the street, was something so far removed from her reality that sometimes it seemed to her that she was not of this world at all. She was used to luxury, wealth, and attention. From childhood she was surrounded by care, the warm comfort of expensive houses, gifts, and holidays. Her every wish was fulfilled without hesitation. It was a world that seemed perfect. But the older Diana got, the more she felt that something was wrong in this world. She couldn't figure out what it was. Maybe all the attention she received from people wasn't because of her intelligence or her dignity, but because she was the daughter of a rich and successful businessman. She didn't know how to make sense of these feelings. Diana was sure that her parents had always loved her, but lately she has been getting a strange feeling. She was afraid that her relationships with others, especially men, depended solely on how much money she had and how her life looked. This especially bothered her in her relationship with Carlos, her young man. He was intelligent, honest, and kind, but Diana couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't love her for her inner qualities, but for everything she stood for. What if he only enjoyed being able to spend time with the daughter of a wealthy businessman? The Carlos she'd been dating for the past few months seemed like a real man, but doubt lurked in her soul. What if he wasn't with her if she was just an ordinary girl, with a low-income family, without her stylish outfits and expensive cars? She couldn't be sure Carlos wouldn't be with her if she didn't live in a house like this, and wasn't surrounded by glitz. These thoughts haunted her, and she couldn't shake the feeling of insecurity. It was at that moment, standing at the window and watching the lights of the city fade, that Diana made a decision. She had to conduct a test to see if Carlos really loved her, or if he was only attracted to her money and status. She decided to hide behind a mask, pretend to be poor, and have her life changed beyond recognition. She turned to her father, who, as always, was ready to fulfill her every request. Diana proposed a strange idea to him. She asked him to make her life change. She wanted to become an ordinary girl so that Carlos would love the real her, without any privileges. "Daddy, I know it's strange," she said, weighing each word, "but I want to try. I want to see if I love him or if I'm just living in his expectations. He has to love me, not what I have to offer him. I'm ready to give up everything I have." Her father, Valery, was a man of determination and success. He understood that his daughter sometimes overestimated her feelings, but he also saw her suffering. He was ready to support her in this difficult situation, because he knew that for Diana this was an important step in self-discovery. "Okay," he replied, "I understand what you want. I'll do what you ask. But you have to realize that this is no joke. We're going to change everything. You're going to have to change your life for a while." A few days later, Diana moved into a small studio apartment on the outskirts of town. Her new home was so far from what she was used to that at times she felt like she had entered a completely different world. There were no luxurious light fixtures, gold-threaded carpets, or expensive upholstered couches. The apartment was old, the furniture was second-hand, and the window didn't offer a view of the whole city, just a neighboring house. But for a moment, Diana felt this new place begin to give her a sense of freedom. Now she could live like a normal person, without the benefits that had always surrounded her. Her life changed from day to day. She started working at a cafe, but she wasn't prepared for how hard it would be to hide her true identity. Every day she got up early to get to work on time, and every evening, tired, she returned to her small apartment. Carlos, meanwhile, had no idea that his girlfriend was hiding the truth from him. She continued to support him, to answer messages, to spend time with him, but increasingly she felt like a stranger in this world she had never existed in before. Diana could feel her confidence melting away with each passing day. She began to doubt herself. Finding herself among ordinary people who had no interest in her condition, she realized that there was no room for play in her life. Carlos didn't notice the changes in her life. He continued to give her flowers, go on dates, and she couldn't figure out if he really loved her or if he was staying with her for the same reason as before, because she could provide him with a comfortable life. Every day her doubts grew, and she became more and more lost. But one evening, as she sat in a cafe trying to hide her inner struggle, Carlos came and sat down next to her. He looked at her, and there wasn't a shadow of doubt in his eyes. He simply took her hand and said, "Sveta, You know, I don't care where you live or what you have. I care about you, not for what you have, but for who you are." Those words were what she had been searching for so long, but couldn't find. It was proof that her doubts were misplaced. She realized that Carlos didn't love her for her wealth, but for her soul, and she finally felt her experiment was complete. All she needed was to be sincere. It had been a few days since Diana had started her life on the other side of the barricades. Each new day was like a little challenge, and with each step she realized more and more how deep she had gotten into her game. When her life was filled with expensive restaurants, parties, and fancy cars, she could appear confident and independent. But now that her world was confined to a small apartment on the outskirts of town, simple lunches at cafes, and participation in boring cashier training, Diana was beginning to feel almost invisible. It was strange and scary, but it also gave me freedom. There were many things in her new world that she hadn't perceived before, because she had never faced such challenges. Diana started working at the cafe. Working as a cashier, serving customers, lifting boxes of groceries, it was so far from her usual life that she began to have doubts. What if I can't take it? But she continued on, trying to follow her plan. Carlos couldn't know what was really going on. She continued to hide her true identity, even as her inner world was crumbling. The first test was the first people she met at the cafe. The staff weren't the friendliest, but they all saw her as an ordinary, insignificant girl who was perhaps not that excited about her new role. Each day brought new tasks, and each time Diana felt more and more alien in this world. Her colleagues in the cafe often gave her ironic glances, and one day one of them, Lena, couldn't resist. "Aren't you tired here? Do you think this is your life?" she asked with a smirk, bowing her head. "If I were you, I'd have given up a long time ago. You have a chance to turn things around, but here you sit and washing dishes." Diana felt bitterness squeezing her chest and replied, trying to hide her feelings. "Everyone has their own path. I've decided to take this step. It's part of my growth." Lena laughed, but there was no kindness in her laughter. She shrugged and walked away. Those words echoed in Diana's head. She really wasn't ready for this growth. There had never been room in her life for such petty concerns, and now she had to deal with things that had seemed insignificant before. But here, in this world, that was the norm. And despite her internal struggle, she continued to adjust to the new rhythm without giving in to despair. Carlos continued to show up for dates, and he didn't suspect that his girlfriend wasn't really who she thought she was. He continued to be attentive and caring, and Diana was beginning to notice how his concern touched her heart. He always asked how she was feeling, worried about her when she came home late from work. He was there for her. He didn't complain about her odd behavior, and it all seemed almost too good to be true. Diana couldn't understand why he didn't notice that her life had changed. Why didn't he notice her fatigue and changes? One evening, as they were walking through the park, Carlos said, "You know, I noticed that you've become a little withdrawn. You get lost in your thoughts a lot. I wouldn't want you to hide anything from me." Diana was silent. Carlos's words were like arrows piercing her defenses. She felt terrible. How could she explain to him that this was all just part of her game, part of her experiment? Should she tell him the truth? Should she reveal herself to see how he would react, or continue to hide everything and fear he would be disappointed? "No," she finally said. "It's okay. Just work. Just a little tired." Carlos turned to her and smiled. "Like, I understand you're trying hard. I'm proud of you. In fact, I'm sure everything will be fine." His words struck a nerve, and in that moment Diana realized that he didn't just not see her change. He genuinely loved her as she was and cared about her inner state. It was so hard to realize this because Diana was already starting to lose faith in her game. She herself couldn't realize that her feelings for Carlos were becoming real, and it was confusing her. What if she'd been right all along? What if he really wasn't with her because of her wealth and status, but for real? Each day she spent in her new role shattered her mask more and more, and despite her best efforts, Diana realized that her feelings for Carlos were changing. It wasn't just an act. She was beginning to see him as more than a test, but as real love, and that was what was causing her to question her decision. She began to think that she could open up to him, be real with him. But then, what would happen to her experiment? And most importantly, what if she couldn't get her old life back? All her game, all this pretense that had seemed such a good decision in the beginning, was now becoming a trap for her. She could no longer tell where the truth began and the lies ended. Carlos was becoming not just an object of scrutiny, but a real part of her life. And now Diana was faced with a choice: keep pretending or giving up everything she had built. As the weeks passed, Diana realized that her life under the mask was becoming increasingly difficult. She had grown accustomed to the comforts of her life, and now that she was forced into hiding, many things became unbearably hard. Every day was an ordeal. The physical fatigue of working at the cafe, the empty apartment, the constant strain of having to hide her true identity. It was all consuming her, and Diana began to feel like she was losing herself. When she had first decided to do this experiment, it had seemed simpler. Hide for a while, test Carlos's feelings, and go back to her old life. But now she realized that this experiment was pulling her deeper and deeper into an illusion that was increasingly becoming reality. Every morning when Diana went to work, she felt her soul being torn apart. Working as a cashier, serving people who didn't even know who she was hard. It seemed so fake, and her mind couldn't quite grasp her role yet. For in truth, Diana was not the person she portrayed herself to be. She was a woman accustomed to luxury, and every step, every glance of the cafe staff caused her pain. Her attitude to her work became more and more alienated, and her inner state more and more exhausted. But the hardest part was meeting Carlos. He continued to care for her, unaware that she was hiding the truth from him. He didn't know how hard it was for her every day, how she suffered from the constant pretense. He still kept giving her flowers, taking evening walks in the park, and every gesture he made her heart clench with guilt. But the most painful part was that Diana began to notice how her own feelings for Carlos had become much stronger and more real. She could no longer just play. Her emotions became deeper, and she began to feel that her love for him could not be fake. One evening, when they met again at the cafe, Carlos said something that made her heart sink. "Sveta, I think you've changed. You're not the same person you used to be. I want to help you, but I don't know what's going on with you," he said with concern in his voice. "You can talk to me. I'll understand." Her eyes filled with tears for a moment, and she turned away hastily. Everything she'd been hiding from him was coming out. She couldn't deceive him any further. His words seemed real to her, and she could no longer continue this experiment so easily. She realized she couldn't deceive the man she was beginning to really love. But in that moment, Diana felt that she was no longer in control of this situation. As they walked outside, Diana stopped and took a deep breath, trying to gather her thoughts. Everything she was feeling was overwhelming her, but she needed to decide what to do next. "Carlos," she said, finally pulling herself together, "I have something very important to confess to you. You deserve to know the truth. I'm not who you think I am." Carlos looked at her, frowning slightly. There was no fear or resentment in his eyes, only genuine concern. "You can tell me anything, Sveta. You know I'm not judging you. I just need to understand what's going on." Diana felt her hands begin to tremble. She realized that this decision would decide everything. She had to tell him everything, despite her fear that he would leave. "I'm not the girl you think I am," she said, pressing her lips together to keep from crying. I'm the daughter of a rich businessman. I live in another world, and you didn't know about all this because I decided to do an experiment. I pretended to be poor to see if you loved me, or just for what I had to offer." Carlos was silent, his eyes scrutinizing her face. Diana felt her words hanging in the air like a heavy weight that she was now finding it hard to carry. Did you do this to test me?" His voice was quiet, but there was no judgment in it. He looked confused, as if Diana's words didn't quite match his expectations. "Yes," she answered, her voice trembling. "I didn't know how else to know if you really loved me. I was sure that if I was around, you like a normal girl, you'd realize who I really was. I wanted to know if you loved me for who I am, not for the money." Carlos stared at her for a few seconds, before his face went soft again. He took her hand. "Sveta, you know, I didn't think you'd do this. You could have just told me, and I would have understood. I couldn't love you for money. I love you for your kindness, for your sincerity. You are more than all of that to me." Diana couldn't believe her ears. All her fears, all her doubts began to melt away. She had expected him to be disappointed, or at least distant. But his words were full of confidence and honesty. It was so unexpected that she couldn't hold back her tears. "I'm sorry," she said, feeling her voice breaking. "I really didn't think it would be like this." "I'm sorry?" Carlos smiled, pressing her hand to his heart. "You don't have to apologize. I just needed to understand how you felt. I'm glad you trusted me." Diana felt her soul fill with relief and joy. All those weeks of doubts, fears, and worries were suddenly gone. She realized that the real test for her was not to test Carlos, but to learn how to be real with him. She truly wanted their relationship to be built on honesty and trust. That night back at home, she closed her eyes and felt herself getting lighter. She no longer felt like an outsider in the world she was building. She had learned to appreciate what really mattered and realized that sincerity and love were far more important than any material possessions. Diana sat on the edge of her bed in the dim light of the lamp that softly illuminated her small apartment. It was a strange feeling to be simultaneously so close to understanding, and yet so far from it. The moment she had opened up to Carlos, everything around her had become clear to her, but that clarity brought new questions. She couldn't just forget everything that had happened. Her life now depended entirely on what happened next. Carlos didn't walk away, didn't pull away. He was there for her despite everything she was hiding, but her heart still clutched at the feeling that her deception had been too great to simply forget. She couldn't allow herself to sink back into the world of lies, but at the same time she couldn't shake the guilt of putting Carlos through this ordeal. The next morning, Diana woke up with a heavy head, and for a second, she forgot what had happened. Soon she came back to reality, and everything she had experienced in the last few days came flooding back. In that moment she realized her relationship with Carlos now depended on one simple thing: whether she would stay honest with him or fall back into the trap of her own fear of exposure. Diana decided that she needed to talk to him. It was important not only for her, but for their future. She knew that you couldn't build a relationship on lies, no matter how hard it was to face the consequences of your actions. She was ready to finally be herself, without deceit or trickery. When Carlos came to see her that evening, Diana felt her heart beat faster. She realized that she would no longer hide the truth. Now she had to open up completely, without any remaining doubts or reservations. "Carlos, I want to talk," she said, her voice determined but tinged with anxiety. Carlos looked at her with slight surprise, but his gaze was warm, and it gave her strength. He sat down next to her and took her hand. "You know you can tell me anything, Sveta," he said, his voice calm and confident. She sighed and looked at his face, trying to find the sincerity in it that he always showed. Diana knew this was the moment of truth. If she didn't step forward, everything could fall apart. "I'm still not sure you'll understand," she began, but she felt her words echoing in her chest. "I lied to you. I hid the truth because I was afraid you would only be with me because of my condition. I wanted to test you, to see how you felt." Carlos was silent, but his gaze became more and more attentive. He held her hand tighter, as if he were supporting her in this moment. "I know, Sveta," he said calmly. "I can already feel that you were trying to show me something other than what you are. But you've still been honest, even though you've tried to hide." Diana looked at him in surprise. His words weren't rebuke, but rather understanding. It was exactly what she'd been looking for so long, the ability to be herself and feel accepted despite everything. "I was afraid that if I told you the truth, you'd leave," she admitted, her voice quieter. "I was afraid that you would only be with me for what I had to offer. But now I realize that the most important thing is to be yourself, and I'm willing to be honest with you." Carlos smiled slightly and looked at her, and there wasn't the slightest hint of judgment in his eyes. He just looked at her with the understanding she had been looking for so long. "Sveta," he said softly, "I don't want to be with you for your money or status. I love you for who you are. And if you hadn't opened up to me, I would have continued to be with you, not because you're my girlfriend, but because I like you as a person. It's your soul, your mind, that's what I'm attracted to." These words came out of his mouth so sincerely that Diana felt all her fears and anxieties begin to dissipate. She realized that her game was up, and despite all her fear, she was ready to accept it. "Do you really think so?" she asked, unable to believe her happiness. Carlos nodded and placed her hand on his chest. "Of course I think so. I'm ready to be with you in any position. Just be real, and I'll be there for you." That moment when their gazes met was a turning point for Diana. She no longer felt the weight of deception on her. She felt she could be herself now. This was a new stage in their relationship, a real step into the future they could build together. Diana hugged Carlos tightly, and a feeling began to blossom in her heart that hadn't been there before. The certainty that love wasn't about what you get, but what you give by being yourself. Her world was no longer divided into roles. She was no longer a person hiding who she was. She now knew that true happiness was only possible through honesty and openness. Everything had changed. And now that she dared to reveal herself, she felt her life becoming real. Not as a mask, not as an illusion, but as a reality in which there is room for love and sincerity. After Diana spoke candidly to Carlos about her experiment, her doubts and fears, her life took a new direction. They couldn't go back to the way things were before, but it wasn't necessary. Their relationship had become not just a test for her, but the true beginning of something more. There was a feeling in her soul, in her heart, that everything had changed. And it had nothing to do with outward well-being, with the things that had seemed so important before. It had to do with the very essence of the relationship, with trust, with sincerity, and with the fact that they were now on the same page. Diana felt alive again. She was no longer the girl who pretended to be someone else, trying to please her environment and her partner. She was herself, and that was her biggest discovery. She had always wanted to be loved in her life, but she didn't realize that true love starts with accepting yourself. With each passing day, Carlos became more than just a guy for her to spend time with, but a man with whom she shared her true feelings, her experiences. He not only supported her, but taught her to trust. She was learning to view the world not through the lens of fear and mistrust, but through sincerity and love. A few weeks later, they began to build a new life. Diane quit her job at the coffee shop and found a new place where she could work without having to hide her identity. She was no longer trying to be someone else, and her inner sense of self became much clearer. Carlos supported her in all her endeavors, and together they began to discover new horizons. Diana thought more and more about her future. She realized that now her life was not just a series of tests and manipulations, but a real life experience. She finally began to realize that you can be happy only when you stop playing a role and start living in reality, without masks. And it was a long journey, but Diana felt it was worth it. One evening, as they sat together on a park bench, Carlos said, as if by chance, "You know, Sveta, I've been thinking a lot about us, about what happened, and I feel like we've both become to each other what we should be. You know now that I love you, not for what you have, but for who you are." Diana looked up at him, her eyes sparkling in the light of the street lamps. She was ready to tell him something important, and in that moment, her heart was completely at peace. "I've also realized that true love doesn't need to be tested. It just has to be. You've accepted me for who I am, and I'm grateful for that. You've given me a chance to be real, and I realize that's the most precious thing of all." Carlos took her hand, and they sat in silence for a long time, savoring the fact that they had found each other. Diana couldn't say they were perfect. There were times when they disagreed with each other, when there were misunderstandings, but now she knew that their relationship was not built on illusions, but on real understanding. Their life went on, but now Diana felt that she was stronger. She was no longer afraid of losing the one she loved, because she had learned not only to love, but to trust. There was no point for her to hide her true identity, and she was now ready to face the future with confidence. Diana and Carlos had begun to build a life together, and although there were many challenges ahead of them, she knew that now they could get through them together, without fear or doubt.